All right. Hi, everybody. We are here today with Joanna Cappuccilli. Hello, Joanna.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be
You
here.
all may know Joanna already because we did a Q&A with her about her transition from teaching into instructional design in the tech space. So that's where we went over Joanna's entire journey. But this session is about acing the ID interview specifically. And as we kind of hinted from the last session, you could tell Joanna knows her stuff when it comes to the interview process. I know you spent over 50 hours of prep when you were going through it, and I know you've only been learning more um, since then. So that's what we're getting into today. I have some questions prepared for Joanna to kind of get us started. But if you all have questions while you watch, please ask them in that Q&A tab. Vote on the ones you'd like to see answered, and we'll make sure that we answer your questions as well. Cool.
Awesome. Yeah.
All right. So I guess we'll pick up the journey from after you've completed your portfolio website, your resume was in good shape, and then you started kind of putting your name in the hat again. Like part two, now that you know you're more competitive with the portfolio for people who kind of know your backstory.
Yes. Yeah. So I went through several stages, and then once I started getting interviews, it was really obviously really exciting. But then kind of reality sets in about okay, now I actually have to go into this interview and try to ace it. And I think I definitely had. I was very nervous going into it. Had a lot of anxiety about wanting to present myself in the best way, and I think at that point I'd been on this journey for so long that I was putting a lot of pressure on succeeding in these interviews. And I wasn't working at the time, so I just really, really wanted to do well. So my mindset was, I was definitely really nervous. And I think, I often err on the side of being more introverted too. So then there was that aspect as well. So I think, but I think also too, just I had to remind myself like getting that interview was the first step, and that was just something to be kind of take a moment and be proud of as well. So that's kind of where I was battling those two feelings going into the process.
Okay, nice. Because yeah, you had invested probably 10 months of time now, right? You wound up
Yeah.
leaving your job. You're fully committed to this thing. You've been investing tons of time. You invested money into making this transition happen. So now you're getting the interviews, and yeah, you're feeling a lot of pressure. I guess you're if I mess up at this point, I'm still not gonna have the job. So I could see
Yeah.
how, yeah, especially if you're more introverted, and I'm sure a lot
Mhm.
of us here can relate to that.
Yeah.
Um, it can be, yeah, that can be anxiety inducing for sure. But you kind of reframed it in your mind before even going into the interviews, and you're like, "Let's just count this as a win. Just this is just an opportunity, this is just a win to be in this position in the first place."
Yeah, I think like there was a lot of kind of self-reflection and I guess like sort of empowering myself throughout that process just to get like to combat the nerves and the anxiety and that like introverted feeling. And I think that's where yeah, kind of looking back at everything I'd done and just even getting the interview and being like I should really just applaud myself for getting this far, and then and that's where I dove into preparation because I think in general I'm someone that's going to prepare if I'm nervous, but that's why I went kind of crazy and did like 50 to 60 hours because I just felt like if I keep pushing myself and keep preparing, then the less nervous I'll be when I actually get into these interviews.
Okay, nice. So yeah, that makes sense. And how we got into the 50 hours of interview prep.
Yeah.
You're like, I got this opportunity. I'm not gonna mess it up. You're like, I have the time, so let's
Yeah.
figure out how to
Definitely.
make this happen. And I guess that's the what you're gonna be sharing with us today. You're gonna condense some of that 50 hours of what you've learned and the experience you had going through it into this hour-long session. So
Yes.
um
Summarize everything.
so I'm sure there are many places we could dive into from there, but I think one of the most common places where IDs may struggle in an interview is reframing that experience, especially people who are transitioning into the field. They don't have formal ID experience. And I've
Mhm.
talked to a lot of people where they're like, "Oh, I'm in on maybe 5 or 10 interviews, but I'm not getting any offers, and the only feedback I'm getting is that I don't have enough experience." And
Yeah.
so, how did you approach that? It's you didn't have a formal ID job before, but how did you approach talking knowledgeably and, presenting that air of experience, if you will?
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good question. That's something I struggled with in the beginning too, because I did get a couple interviews, but I don't think I was presenting myself kind of as someone that had the skill set. And I think that's kind of where it came back to reflecting on all of my experience. And I always say this a lot, but I started a document where I just went through like every point on my resume and really reflected on like all the different projects and different experiences I had at the job, so that I could sort of like broaden my view of what my skill set was. Because I think once I started trying to move away from like the actual definition of what a SME is, or what like an LMS is, or something like that, and I really looked at what what those skills were, or what what the skills were within that thing that they wanted, then I could see how my experience connected better. So like, for example, with a SME, just subject matter expert, you might get kind of thrown off at first. Like, oh, I have never worked with a SME, but if you really think about what that is, it's just basically consulting with someone who has expert knowledge on something. And so if you think about in teaching, like, have you consulted with someone who knows something that you don't know, and have they been a part of, like, have they helped you work on a learning experience in some way? And once I was able to zoom out and kind of think of it like that, it helped me find where I could connect the dots and show that I did have that experience. And even if I didn't have that exact title, I still had the knowledge, I guess.
So specifically, you're talking about, this example of working with the subject matter expert. You see that in all of these ID job postings. That's like a necessary skill for the job. And I guess the first reaction is like, I've never worked with this me. Then it's like, well, subject matter expert. I've worked with people who are like knowledgeable about a topic, and I kind of work with them to build a learning experience. So you're kind of
Yeah.
like drawing on your past experiences and like pulling these examples and stories that would satisfy these different requirements on a job listing, for example.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it kind of becomes this process of, like I've been saying, like this process of empowerment throughout, and just kind of owning where you're at with it, and owning like, okay, I didn't necessarily in my last job say I worked with a SME, but I know I did, because I exhibited the skills that are needed to work with SMEs, I suppose. So kind of like reframing it and owning it within yourself first, I think really helps you articulate that better in the interviews. And also just being like, and showing how you have, I guess also being honest with the knowledge gaps that you have too. Like, for example, I hadn't worked very much with an LMS, but like, the learning management system. And so I feel like I tried to sort of show that I understood what that was, at least, and that I was willing to go that extra mile to learn that. And that, I did have the skills to actually go about learning that on the job. So kind of bridging the gap for them too, and showing that you're eager to learn it and that you will.
Okay, nice. So it's not necessarily like lying or saying, "Oh, I know I do have like 3 years of formal ID experience." Like, you can acknowledge that you've never held a formal ID job, or you've never had that title, but that you've still been doing a lot of the tasks that you would need to do in an ID role. And like, you can help bridge the gaps. Like, this is what I was doing. This is super similar to like what I would be doing here. Like, helping the person that you're interviewing with, like, kind of, you're connecting those dots for them, instead of saying, "Oh yeah, I was a teacher. You should know I worked with SMEs." It's like
Yeah.
you're kind of telling those stories to build your own credibility and show, "Yeah, I've been doing things that can kind of help me out here."
Yeah, and I think, and also too, just even being willing to sort of reframe it too in your own mind, in the sense of like, if you did have a co-teacher that you consulted with to design a lesson plan, you can kind of reframe that and say, I worked with a SME to design a learning experience. And so it's not lying, because you did do that. It's just kind of like how you're using that terminology for them, so that they can see where those dots are being connected as well.
Okay, nice. So that seems like kind of like one of the early steps, one of the early necessary steps in this process is like learning the terminology. Like, what words do we use in the instructional design space to even refer to these things? Once I know what these words are and what they mean, then I can kind of start trying to like think about my own experience in those terms. That's like
Yeah.
kind of the process you followed for this.
Yeah, definitely learning, learning the terminology, just kind of, finding some ID resources, watching stuff on YouTube or podcasts, but then also really diving into those job descriptions, because that's where you're going to see the specific terminology that each company needs or wants. Because it might be, you might see it generally in like a general ID resource page, but if you're looking at how it's in that particular company, it might change. It might be a little bit different. And I have talked about this before too, but I can also provide an example. One of the companies I interviewed for was really focused on agile development. And that, on first look, I'm kind of like, well, I don't know if I've done that. Can I even say that I've done that? And when I started reading about what that was, it was basically just being able to produce things rapidly and iterate quickly to kind of get results. And when I thought about an experience that I had done, I was creating a digital workbook that, at the last second, the admin came back to me and said that they wanted me to change an entire chapter, and we had a tight deadline to do it. And that's an example like of creating something within that agile framework. And it's not necessarily like in the tech space, but it's still relatable, and you can show that you're able to work under pressure and develop things quickly in a certain time frame.
Nice. Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah.
Very good. So not just the general ID reframing. Oh yeah, learning experience, subject matter expert, so on and so forth, but also looking at these specific job postings or learning more about these specific companies or roles, and then kind of using that as another source of like the language that you can use to frame your experiences within. That's good. And I can just imagine it's like, oh, do you have experience with agile? It's like, well, I didn't call it that when I was doing it, but this is the situation I was in, use that good old STAR method, which we'll get to.
Yeah.
And I could see how that would make you seem like super credible and qualified. And it would feel like you have experience doing this stuff, even
Mhm.
though on first glance, it's like, oh, I'm not qualified for this. I haven't done that. That sounds like so corporate-y.
Yeah, yeah,
um,
exactly. Yeah, there's definitely a layer of like the ID terms and then also the corporate terms too. So I think in like half of it really, I think, and once I started seeing more success in the interview process is when I just started acknowledging that, yeah, I have done agile development. Even though I didn't feel like I'd done that, it really helped me carry out and like show that I could do these things when I owned that within myself.
yeah,
So
good point. But okay, so you worked on that reframing before ever like getting into the interviews at this next
mm,
stage. I mean, again, because yeah, you had like your early stage where you're like apply to everything, see what I can get, and then you're like, that was phase one. And then
yeah.
towards the later phases, it's like refocus on the portfolio, do all of this prep. You're like, I'm gonna do it right and make sure I get like a really good role. So once you started going into the interviews for that part, you worked on this reframing kind of before even going into it, right?
Yeah, I think for the most part, I had one interview that I didn't do well in, and I hadn't really done much prep for it. And
Okay.
then after that first interview, I realized this was going to be a much bigger undertaking to like reframe my experience and feel comfortable in the process. So yeah, then at that point, I is when I really started putting in all the hours, and then I went into the interview experience much more prepared.
Nice. Okay.
Yeah.
And so you probably experienced like a range of like types of interviews because I know like not all interviews are created differently, and maybe some people here don't really know what to expect with the corporate ID interview process. So can you tell us what different types of interviews to expect?
Yeah, so I would say I saw like probably 6 different types of
Wow.
interviews if I really had to put like if I had to differentiate them. The first one was almost always was the HR interview where I was talking with a recruiter and they were kind of just trying to get like general background info about you and like how I would fit with the position. And then I usually had a technical type interview after that, which was getting into the more ID theory and like design process and how do you work with SMEs and things like that. And then sometimes, usually at most places, I had a behavioral interview as well, and that was like really getting into like who you are and how you perform on like in the job, like in that job role, and how you would take on challenges or how you like would help make impacts on a larger level. And then there was the work sample, which was just kind of creating that e-learning experience under a short amount of time, like within a deadline. And then usually there was also a leadership, and I did have one leadership interview as well, where I had to kind of the interview was really geared towards understanding who I am as a leader. Um, and then, yeah, the last one was usually a panel interview. So that was sometimes with people that, because as the instructional designer, you're not always in roles where you're working as a team. And so you might be, helping create experiences for customers that have like no idea or who don't have any knowledge on learning design. So there was one company that I interviewed for that was like a financial investment company, and so they wanted me to do a panel interview with the financial advisors, just because those are the people I'd be working with. So yeah, there was quite a few different types of interviews that were really different than I'd ever experienced as a teacher. So that's where all that preparation came in, because I felt like sometimes I didn't even know what I was going to be getting when I was moving through the rounds.
Right. Yeah. So that's a good overview. I don't know if we're gonna dive like super deep into all of those, but yeah, if anyone has a specific question about any of them, feel free to ask it.
Yeah.
Um, let's get into like the actual specific interview questions. And I know they might vary a little bit based on the stage you're at or the type of interview, but maybe we'll speak generally. If you need to give like
Mm.
caveats, feel free. But
Yeah.
um, let's start with this. What about common interview questions? So we know these interview types. Did you see certain questions kind of coming up time and time again throughout this process?
Yeah, I think the main ones, which I probably referenced before, are the design process. That's
Yep.
that's huge. Like just being able to they'll ask you, walk me through your design process. Working with SMEs, and then usually a follow up to that is like, how do you handle difficult or unresponsive SMEs? So those were probably the main ones I saw very often. But I also got questions related to like, how have you made an impact with your learning experiences, and then really wanting them to like, uh, I guess, like really wanting proof as to how you actually like made an impact and you actually impacted the success of your learners, and like kind of proving that showing that you have data to back that up.
Nice.
So there was a lot of that, and then also got questions about how many courses I've created, and then kind of defining, was it e-learning, was it instructor led, was it hybrid, and yeah, and just like general questions too related to like, why this company, who, like basically who are you and why do you want this role, and how can you do a good job. So
Yeah.
yeah, those were like the ones I saw probably throughout the entire experience that were the most common ones, but I did get different ones at each interview, like, and a lot of them were usually behavioral based and wanting to know like how I'd taken on certain challenges, or like how I'd led a project, and like how have I uh, how have I come up with solutions and with things that are unclear, and like how do you handle ambiguity, and so a lot of questions around stuff like that.
Okay, good. I feel like there's so much here for us to dive into that would be helpful for
Yeah.
people here in the chat, but
Yeah, there's a
maybe
lot.
yeah, maybe I'll try not to dive too deep into it, but I feel like we should spend a little bit more time on these questions because I think that's what a lot of the anxiety is around is I think people go into interviews and yeah, it feels like kind of like a test. It's like I can't
Mm,
say the wrong thing or I'm gonna like miss this chance.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, so what was your sense like let's say with the design process question. So yeah, what is your design process like? Did you get the sense that they're looking for like a correct answer there or what is your take either from your experience or your research that a hiring
Mm.
manager is looking for when they ask that question?
So I don't think they're necessarily always looking for a correct answer. It's more like, I think how you deliver it, and really like walking through real examples. So what I usually, my go-to was, that I found kind of worked for me, was I always mentioned Addie from the first, just right away I mentioned Addie, and then I would take a real project and then walk them through the steps that I used on that real project. So just kind of giving like a high level overview that I knew what that was, but then also getting deeper into how I'd actually applied it in my real life, like in my real jobs that I'd done. So I think, yeah, not necessarily a right answer, but just being able to show them that you're capable of doing that, and that you have an idea of what your design process actually is.
Nice. Yeah, I think that seems like a really safe way to approach it. I mean, Addy can go one of, Addy, most people know what that is. It's like, oh yeah, Addy, you kind of, you know something about instructional design. And then I
Yeah,
guess other people can be like, I've asked people their design process and they're like lecturing me on what Addy is, which like can frustrate them. But your
mm,
approach seems really, really good. It's like you mention Addy, you're familiar with it, you kind of know the full scope of like the ID process, and then walking them through that in a real project, yeah, I could see how that takes it to the next level. And it's just like a safe answer. If you're like, oh, I'm like use a performance consulting approach, like I'm gonna kind of rework your like whole department. And
Yeah,
unless that's exactly what they're looking for, it's probably gonna be like, we just need someone to make e-learning. So,
yeah, yeah.
so that's
And
a
I
safe response. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think even within Addie too, like, oh, sorry, there's like a lot of room for being creative there too. And if you do
Yeah.
want to kind of talk about like these other really interesting parts of your design process, you can still include that within like as you're walking them through that. So I think that's, yeah, like you said, kind of a safe way to cover both grounds.
Nice, yeah, that's smart. Good, yeah, I'm glad we got into that. And then working with SMEs, you kind of already gave us some hints there. It's like, think of times you've kind of yeah, it's like if you've worked on any sort of learning experience before, which I think a lot of us have, like when we realize, "Hey, I actually really like doing this, like, I'm gonna oh, wow, there's a whole career where I can just do this full time." Um, so
Yeah.
yeah, did you consult someone to kind of bring those learning experiences to life?
Yeah, and I think that can be in any capacity too. Like actually the examples I refer to quite often because for anyone that doesn't know, I worked like in an international setting for a long time. So I was working in South Korea and Taiwan, and a lot of times I was consulting with teachers there to develop these like Mandarin and English programs. So like that was like a language consultant, but it was still a SME because I wasn't an expert on teaching Mandarin. So I think there's a lot of ways that you can go with it, and it's just about like really digging into your experience and trying to be creative with how you approach it.
Right, and then what about that impact piece? I know that can be that's kind of a roadblock for some people because they're like, "Hey, yeah, I don't know. I don't no numbers come to mind. I haven't really been measuring metrics in my previous roles." Um,
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
how did you approach that? That piece I know is tricky for some people, getting measuring
Yeah.
the success.
Yeah, that was hard for me as well because I was also in the beginning really focused on numbers, and numbers are very important. And if you have that, that's always great and better probably. But I think it's too like trying to bring in other pieces of it as well. Like a lot of times I would refer back to like qualitative metrics or like anecdotal evidence and talk about, that might just be I went and talked to the learners and heard about, and maybe the learners are my students even, and just being able to talk to them and hear what like, feedback on that lesson plan or that learning experience, and then being able to put that in a way that shows that you were listening to feedback and you were trying to apply that to the next learning experience that you designed. So I think there are ways that you can approach it, but don't like shy away from that qualitative element as well. So that's kind of how I filled the gap in that area when I
Nice.
didn't have numbers.
Okay, good. Yeah, that seems way more effective than, like, trying to, like, make something up or like, "Oh, like, the
Yeah.
success rate improved," and it's like, "Oh, how do you measure the success rate?" And it's I've seen some people kinda do that on their resume. It's like, "Oh, I need metrics, so,
Yeah.
I'll just make up a metric." But it's like, if you get
Yeah.
questioned about that at all, and, like, a lot of the times it's kinda obvious, it's like, "What does this even mean?"
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Best to
so
avoid
yeah.
that probably.
It seems way safer, yeah, to just talk about, like, the human impact, even if it's not in, like, raw number terms, than
Yeah.
to try to, like, kinda make stuff up or pull numbers out of thin air. So, good suggestion there as well.
And just to add to that too, like you can also always go back and say, yeah, maybe I didn't quantify it this time, but next time this is how I would approach it. So like just showing that
Nice.
you're aware of that maybe you like could include more like number based data, but like just to be aware of it is always good to show.
Yeah, that's smart. I could see how that would definitely make an impact in an interview as well. So, good stuff there, and then just a couple other ones you mentioned, like the why this company, why you. I guess that's like, yeah, it's like sell yourself to me. Like, show me why tell me why you're gonna be a good fit here. Like why are you a good fit for the role? So I guess
Mm,
that's like some storytelling there. Like,
yeah.
what led you into ID, what makes you good for this company specifically. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I think for that, what I ended up doing is this is probably what I guess rehearsed or practiced the most was kind of like a 2 minute little like I guess I would call it the interview thesis statement of just like who I am and what I bring to the table. And then every time I got on a call, that was like the first thing I started with. And then I kind of felt more comfortable then to get into the rest of the questions. So I usually try to think of like the top 3 qualities, and I always try to match it to like what I was seeing on their website or on LinkedIn or in the job description, and then really came in strong with those top 3 things. So a lot of times I saw companies wanted like someone who was customer obsessed, valued diversity, and had good e-learning skills. So I would talk about like I
Nice.
understand e-learning development tools. I have like a global mindset because of these reasons, and I'm passionate about helping people because of these reasons. So that was kind of like that summary that I always came into every interview with.
Nice. Cool. Yeah, and then that kind of sets the tone for like everything else, I guess. I mean, that's a cool way to think about it. Your interview thesis statement.
Yeah.
Because then
Yeah.
that's kind of like your like, yeah, like your touchstone. You kind of tie it back into there. Yeah, I could see how that would really make an impact.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
So with the
very good.
anxiety too.
And then the last question you noted, I mean, I know we have some more questions here, but like taking on challenges, leading a project. Oh yeah, so that's when you're talking about like the behavioral interview questions. And that I guess leads us pretty nicely into how you respond to the interview questions. And I think the most
Mm.
common kind of framework for that, and I think what people are waiting for us to dive into is STAR.
Yeah, STAR. Yes, definitely rely on STAR. I think that really helped me structure my answers. And something that I often left out in the interview process, usually like, prior to using STAR, having like really done all this preparation, I would really shy away from the results side of things. And I think that's really what I found is that people really want to hear that. They really want to know, like, okay, that's great that you did that, but can you prove that you did that? And what have you learned from it? And how would you apply that to other things? So I think if you can really focus on any of that part of STAR, my suggestion would be to really hone in on the R, like hone in on results.
Can
Because I
we
think, yeah.
yeah, should we take a step back and say what STAR is?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So, yeah, situation, task,
Action?
action, results.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so it's kind of just like the way you structure your response. So, like, I mean, I don't know if you want to explain this. My understanding is that you
Mm,
discuss the situation you were in,
yeah.
the task. I don't know. I'm not going to do this justice.
No,
um,
yeah, yeah. Like, so the situation. So, for example, like if I could give an example, I was creating training for teachers abroad to help them like upskill to be better at digital learning.
okay,
And
so
so
that's
like
the situation.
yeah, that'd be the
Okay.
situation. And then the task was that, what was my actual role in it? I was actually the one uh, designing the training and then also implementing it for the teachers. And then the action is like, what did I do to actually make that happen? Like, did I work with SMEs? Did I actually develop it, or was I just doing the storyboarding part of it? Like, what were those specific actions that I took? And then the results was what is the impact? Did the teachers actually upskill at the end, and how can I prove that they did upskill? And what did I learn from that experience, and how did I make my learning experiences better after that? So I guess
Nice.
that's kind of a simple breakdown of what STAR would be.
Okay. And my reaction when I've heard that in the past, and it's like when I've been in these situations, like it's kind of hard to kind of think of this on the fly.
Yeah.
Like, you probably have, like, prepared that example beforehand, it's probably safe to assume.
Yes.
I mean, maybe people who get a ton of practice, like, just pull stuff from their memory and can, like, immediately kinda spin it into this format, but obviously that takes some preparation. So,
Yeah.
what was your approach to that? Did you kinda, like, write down, like, 20 different stories in the STAR format from your experience, or what did that look like?
Yeah, I did. I had a
Okay.
I had like a huge document. I don't even know how many pages, but I had star for like every single story that I wanted to tell, and then I literally would go through like, okay, what's the situation, what's the task, and then I did that for every story that I wanted to bring to the interview. So yeah, very like probably on the side of over preparation, but I think if you are someone that is nervous or wants to kind of like reframe your mindset or reframe your experience, I think like that over preparation really goes a long way. Yeah.
Nice, and for people who are trying to do this, like, for themselves, like, write these stories in the STAR format, you're sourcing the stories from, like, the the job tasks and responsibilities and stuff that you see like in the job listing?
Yeah, so some of that is kind of gauging questions based on the job listing, but then also that's where I was going through my resume and kind of reflecting on all of my
Nice.
experience. And I also had, I not maybe not everyone has this situation, but I had probably like I had a lot of different types of experience, and I had quite a like few different jobs that I had worked at. So it kind of started from just trying to like find the theme of what my experience was, and then it became like a really good reference point for finding those stories within those jobs, and then really breaking them down into star. But yeah, the job posting was helpful for kind of like anticipating what questions they might ask. So, you know, if they talked a lot about like working with an LMS, then I was going to make sure that I had some kind of answer to respond to that. So,
Okay, cool. So not just the job listing, but also your resume, since that is kind of like the 1 page or possibly 2 page summary of your story. That makes a lot of sense. Have kind of
mm,
stories ready to back up each like bullet point you have on there, it sounds
yeah.
like.
Yeah.
And then also I guess just the common interview questions too. Like in your example of your ID process, it sounds like you're kind of using a bit of STAR to respond to that too, where you kind of walk us through how you used it. So
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think I like what someone said in the chat too about like having the narrative of yourself, because I think that's essentially what it is. You know, you got to write your own story for the interview experience.
yeah,
Yeah.
and you seem to have a really good understanding of that, like the thesis of your interview you're talking about, like the theme of your experience, like because that's what you're really doing. You're telling a story, and hopefully that story makes you look like a very competent and driven person who's going to succeed in this role and provide value to this company. So if you
Yeah.
can align your story with like what they're looking for, seems like you've kind of got the job, you've got the offer. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I think I found that tactic sort of like evolved for me as I went through the process, and I realized that it was really, um, you know, really important. And actually got feedback from a hiring manager that said, you know, you seem very self-reflective and really like aware of yourself, and we value that. So I think hiring managers do value someone that, I mean, it sounds cliche, but like knows themselves. So I think that's important to tell your story.
Yeah, and from what we're hearing, you don't know yourself. Just it's not just from like like oh, like I love myself, so I know myself. It's
Yeah.
like it took hours and hours of like detailed reflection on my experiences and
Yes.
why I am a good fit for this field and these roles.
Yeah,
So
pages and pages.
pages and pages, nice. Okay, so I think we did a lot of justice to like the questions, how to respond to questions, and what types of questions to expect. But what about when it comes time for you to ask questions? I know that's always like a piece of this where people might not be sure what to do. Did you
Yeah.
did you have like canned questions that you asked every time, or was it kind of based on the feel of the interview or the specific role?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I usually had kind of like generic questions that I asked every time. Usually was like, what were some of the upcoming projects that I would be expected to join or, you know, help with when I join.
Yeah.
Um, I actually want a big question that I asked a lot, which I found hiring managers liked as well, was what should I learn before I start? Because that also showed like that I was interested in learning before I started the job, and that I was really committed to like wanting to know more about what I had to do. Also asked like what was the most challenging part? What's something you've loved about working at this company? And trying to, you know, asking more like, I guess not personal questions, but more just like, you know, what's your favorite thing about working here, and trying to bring in that like conversational element. And it can help you feel relaxed, help them feel relaxed, and sort of like connecting over things that you like about the job. I also asked like what part of the design process would I be doing when I was at the job. So like,
Nice.
because you're not necessarily always doing the whole thing. You know, you might just be developing the content, or maybe you're just writing the storyboard, or maybe you're doing all of it. So that was an important question that I tried to ask every time too.
Okay, nice. Good ones. Good ones.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know if there are any follow-up questions on those, but yeah, I could see how that would show you have initiative. Yeah, I mean, if you were like asking questions based on things that came up in the conversation, shows those like active listening skills and that you're like actually kind of invested. Um, Yeah,
Yeah.
that question is obviously revealing what part of the design process am I in, especially for finding out, like, if the role is right for you. I know some people, like, they want they only wanna do a specific piece or they wanna do, like they wanna make sure they do some analysis. Um, so that would be a very revealing question for sure. And the upcoming projects one, I hadn't heard that one before, but that makes a lot of sense. It's like, "Oh, what am I gonna be working on first? Like, what am I gonna
Yeah.
be able to dive into when I get started?"
Yeah, like, I'm
So,
super excited. What work am I gonna do?
yeah, that's a good
Yeah.
one.
And, oh,
Alright.
another one too, really quick, was just, like, yeah, looking at things that, would be helpful, like, to show that you've done research on the company. So, like, there was one example where I found a blog
Nice.
from an e-learning developer at the company about a project they'd recently done. Like, it was like a passion project, and they were helping give free e-learning for like researchers or something. So once I brought that up and we connected over like making education more accessible and things like that. So it was, yeah. So things like that, if you can find those connections and ask that at the end, it can be really helpful.
Very cool. And I guess we didn't spend much time discussing that, but yeah, what was that research process like for a company? Yeah, we have the job listing, but it doesn't sound like you
Mhm.
stopped there if you're finding, like, specific blogs written by
Yeah.
employees at the company, so, yeah, what was your research process like when you found a role you were really excited about?
Yeah, so I usually started looking at the company, like there's the generic company website, tried to like dive into every piece of the company, like not necessarily just the e-learning or learning development team. And then I would like write down keywords or phrases that I saw, and then I would get deeper and look at like the learning development team. And then I would try to find them on LinkedIn if I could, and like look at the things they were posting about, look at like their job responsibilities that they kind of said that they were saying were their responsibilities at that job. And then sometimes I found that they would post like news articles, or they would post, I don't know, like, yeah, like that's where I found they posted a blog about something they wrote. And yeah, and then listening to podcasts. I know when I interviewed with AWS, I was listening to like the AWS podcast and AWS morning brief, and just to kind of like listen to what they're talking about. And then even going a step further and listening to like different YouTube videos about the company. Like I found an AWS developer that was talking about different like tech concepts that I would listen to once in a while. So just like really trying to get immersed in the company in every aspect and every like way possible.
Very cool. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's smart, not just, like, looking up news stories on Google, but just seeing what the employees who are working in similar capacities to what you would be doing, like, what are they posting on LinkedIn? How do they define their responsibilities in their role? Because I could see how that could be more insightful even than a job posting if the job posting is just, like, copy and pasted from, like,
Mm,
the other job posting, so that's smart,
yeah.
yeah. How do the people who are doing the work talk about what they're doing? Very
Yeah, it was
cool.
really insightful to look at that.
Nice, okay. Okay, and then this is the last prepared question I have for you, but do you have any other tips for us to succeed on interview day specifically? So we've done all this research, all this prep, but now we have our interview, tomorrow afternoon. What should we
Yeah.
do? How do we prepare for that and make sure we like don't like kind of forget
Mm.
everything we had been researching?
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's definitely a good question. I think like I always had like a shorthand version of things. So I had like a document for every company, and then I would make a shorthand version of that document, and then usually I would print that off, or maybe I would like take notes on paper somewhere and then highlight the keywords. So like if
Mm,
I knew at this particular company I wanted to focus on like my agile development or change management or whatever that was, like based on what I read, or maybe this company was really about customer obsession. So then I would have keywords that I would highlight for each company that I would like make sure I referred back to that so that I didn't forget to mention that. And then I usually had a list of like the top experiences or projects that I'd worked on that I wanted to mention. So like that digital workbook example that I just gave earlier, that was usually on the shorthand version of my on the day kind of preparation. So I had these just like key experiences that I would have like available to me in some paper format so that I could see it quickly and reference it.
okay, nice. So you like designed your own performance support like for the interview. You're like, I have this on hand. I know I'm not alone here. I have my like little cheat sheets
Yeah.
around. Like
Yeah.
I'm gonna be good.
That's a good way to say it. Yeah, performance support. That's
I
basically
mean, yeah,
what
it's what you're yeah, it's like definitely what you're doing. So that's cool. So I'm guessing once you did all of this, when you're going into interviews, kind of probably felt a little bit different than when you're going
Mhm.
into like interview one, I would
Yeah.
imagine.
Yes. Yeah, it was definitely much different at that point. I mean, still got nervous every time, but I think
Yeah.
just having that yeah, like that performance support there was really helpful to be able to refer back to it. And oh, and then something I did too, usually after each interview, even if I didn't know if I was going to get a second one, I usually took notes. So like I would like, okay, I spoke to this person. I remember that they talked about this, so that if I did get called back to a second interview, I could kind of go back and like look at that, like how, like have a reminder of how that first interview went too.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's smart. Cool. So lots of note taking, lots of keeping everything in one place, and then like turn that into performance support if or
Yeah.
as needed.
Yes.
All right, so let's dive into some questions. But yeah, thanks for diving into all this with us. And I know a lot of you or a handful of you here are like in the boot camp, and yeah, we're turning this into like its own course about acing the interview, and we're gonna have
Yeah.
like a mock interview included and stuff like that. So it's going to be very cool. But hopefully, this session will be enough to give a lot of you what you need to kind of make the difference in these interviews. So we have a question from Lisa. If your portfolio is still a work in progress, do you think it's okay to apply for ID positions or is it best to hold off?
Yeah, that's something I remember. I think I talked with you about Devlin a bit too. Like, at what stage should you start applying? And I think once I had that like one at least one solid quality project up on my website, I started getting interviews. I think once I added more, I think it was I probably got more responses. But I would say like at least if you have that one quality project that showcases that you can do the design process from beginning to end, that you'd probably be in a pretty good position, in my opinion, to start applying.
Yeah, it's tough by what you mean by work in progress. If you have that like if like the quality is very high but the quantity is pretty low, that's a really good spot to be applying from. But if
Mhm.
it's in like a very drafty kind of format and maybe there's like the quality control isn't very high, I
Mhm.
mean, one, we don't want the portfolio to be like working against you. Of course, I don't know what state your portfolio is in, but if like the projects are kind of thrown together and not like very refined, it may not be doing much for you, and it may be showing that you don't have a good attention to detail, and we obviously don't want that to happen.
Yeah,
Um,
true. You don't
I
want it
guess
to work against you.
yeah, I guess as far as the sequence, like applying without like a higher quality portfolio is a bit more like I equate it to like playing the lottery kind of, especially because as you can tell from this conversation, like it takes a lot of work to go through this application process.
Yeah.
Um, so it's like kind of more effective to have the portfolio in place that already demonstrates your skills and like going into the interview, people already can see you can kind of do the job to some degree. It kind of makes the next pieces like a bit easier. So the portfolio like won't be holding you back. It'll only be like helping you. Um,
Yeah.
so as far as the sequence, yeah, it generally is a good investment of your time to polish your portfolio site before going through the interview and application process.
Yeah. Yeah. I think the portfolio is really important. And like you said, quality is always better than quantity,
Yeah.
I think.
Okay, good question, Lisa. Thank you for that. We have a question from Nen. Do you have any tips or suggestions on negotiating salaries and benefits? Good question, especially for new IDs.
Yeah, that was something I faced, in the beginning a lot too. And I think I probably mentioned this in the last one, but in the beginning I was really ready to just kind of take whatever came my way because I was super ready to have a job at that point. But I think, yeah, I think that's where like just I guess knowing your worth and knowing the market and knowing what your skill set should get you and like what other people are getting paid in those positions. That's really important. And just yeah, not being afraid to settle. Like you don't have to settle if you do have all those skills and you have that expertise and you do go through the process. You don't have to settle. So yeah,
And
I don't know.
so what was that like for you going through this offer? I don't know if we mentioned it last or going through this process. Like, did you like you had multiple offers basically? Um, offer to you. So
Yeah.
it probably made it easier to kind of negotiate or be in a position to, like, accept, like, yeah, the most compelling offer, where if you just have to one person making you that offer, I guess you have a little bit, like, less leverage than if you had a couple of other companies who were, like, trying to get you on board as well.
Yeah, yeah, and that's definitely the piece where it can get challenging. And I think that's where I guess if you are going to strategize your interviews, like try, in my opinion, I would say try to like apply for them all at once so that you can kind of move through the process at the like in the same stage or at the same rate. Because then when you do get to the offer stage, you can kind of like you'll have multiple offers rather than like applying, months prior and then like maybe 6 months later or whatever. Like so going through the process at the same time can be really helpful. And also trying to like don't be afraid to schedule the interviews when it works best for you. Like I know I had one interview, like the final round of one of the companies, they wanted to do it at a certain time, but I really tried to keep pushing so that it matched like within the same week of one of the other companies that I had the final round at. So you can
Nice.
kind of strategize in those ways, I think.
Yeah, that's a good suggestion because companies kind of know people have other options to them, and they will try to use tactics to get you to kind of commit as soon as possible. Like, I've seen that happen a lot. It's like, we need to know, like, within 2 days if you accept it or not. It's like these,
Yeah.
like, high pressure kind of tactics. So,
Yeah.
obviously, if you don't have any other offers, you may kind of feel like you need to do that. But if you know there are a few other places you're interviewing with and you're like a top choice for them too, or one of the top choices, it's kind of like, well, yeah, maybe I have to give up this company who's like trying to pressure me into this, and I'm sure I'll get some good offers from these other ones. So it is tough. It is there is a degree of risk. Obviously, the longer you hold out, and a lot of people I work with, it is like you can earn more, but there is going to be a little bit more uncertainty in it. It is a little, it may be holding out another month or so to accept an offer, so sometimes people are more than happy to accept that first good offer that they are happy with that comes their way, even before letting the other interviews get resolved or land in offers. And that happens a lot. They accept the offer, and then a week or two later, another offer comes in, and it's like, oh wait, no, like I already accepted a role. Sorry.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I would suggest if you're in that position, let the other companies kind of know, hey, I'm thinking about accepting this offer. Were you planning on making me an offer here? Like, kind of
Mhm.
communicate with the other companies. But
Yeah,
we could probably do a whole session on, like, negotiation as well, so,
definitely. Yeah.
um
That's something I had, yeah, something to learn for sure. It's not something that came naturally for me. So
and I
yeah.
think it is too just acknowledging, like, when you are, like, out of work, and it's like, yeah, I'm just trying to transition into the field, I do wanna get my foot in the door. I think generally people are a lot more comfortable accepting the first good offer that comes their way because they don't wanna have to worry about, "Oh, am I gonna run out of savings?" Or
Yeah.
yeah, it's like there is a bit more pressure to kinda land that first good role than to, "I'm gonna hold out for, like, getting my dream conditions met." So, it's
Yeah.
a bit easier to do that once you're already comfortably in the field and you have some real solid formal experience. Good
Yeah,
question.
absolutely.
We have a question from Caitlin. Do you have any tips about exploring the company culture, making sure that the company is a good fit for you?
Yeah. So exploring the company culture, I think that's where like all that research came into play. So I think if you're kind of doing all that research ahead of time about the company, you're going to learn a lot of things about the culture in that way, like kind of what you're seeing online and like what like the employees are posting. But I think also just, asking those questions in the interview, like not being afraid to ask what the company culture is like and trying to see if it does match your values. And that's where kind of in that one example I gave about finding that passion project from one of the employees at a certain company, and realizing that they really cared about accessible education. And that was something that I was able to, by finding that ahead of time, I was able to use that as a starting point to open a discussion about like those types of values that the company held. So I think yeah, that kind of research will help guide the discussion, and it kind of sheds light on what yeah, like what they care about and what the culture is like.
True. Yeah, the question was, like, about asking about company culture, but yeah, I got the sense you can kinda pick up a lot
Mhm.
from the research you're doing, from what you're seeing from the people who work there. Yeah, what are they kinda talking about? What are they sharing? And I know I've seen common suggestions. There's, like, the standard, like, like the Glassdoor or, like, the
Mhm.
employee review kind of sites, with the
Yeah.
caveat that there may be more unhappy people commenting than happy people. But
Yeah, true.
there are probably a lot of different windows into the company culture. But I imagine talking to people who are in the role could be quite effective. But
Yeah.
again, sometimes within a company, it does vary like tremendously from team to team. So
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. I think, yeah, talking to as many people as you can, but then knowing that, like, trying to ask when you actually are in that interview and trying to bring it up in a way that sheds light on what that culture is like, I think
yeah.
is good.
And even some of the questions you mentioned earlier about like what to ask at the end of an interview, like some of those can kind of shed light on things too, like the projects you'll be working on, where in like the ID process you'll be spending most of your time. Um,
Mm,
some of
yeah.
those could be revealing as well.
Another good one too is just like how is the learning team supported? Like like what does the company how does the company feel about learning and development, and how do they support you in that? That's what can also be revealing about the culture around your particular team as well.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. We have a question from Aressa. How do you make a new entry level portfolio not look so empty and sad? You can't always post full examples from company projects, or you may not have many being new to the field. So I think we maybe
Yeah.
touched on that a little bit, but yeah, the quality over quantity piece is like very important. Like most of the people that I work with or that I see landing like really great roles like this, they have between 1 and 3 projects on their portfolio. Like how many do you have on your portfolio? Like 2, I think, right? Or do you have a third?
Yeah. No, yeah, I only have two. And like having those process write-ups too, and just kind of like talking about what that experience was like, and like what that experience of creating the project was like. So I think there's ways to make it not seem so empty and sad. But I think like just yeah, like that's where it goes back to quality, because I think if you do have a really quality project that's using different types of e-learning development tools, that's going to really come through to the hiring managers.
Yeah, and that piece is important too, not just like the quality, but like a quality project that shows off like the in-demand skills. If it's like a really good quality project, but it's for like some like teaching project, like a PowerPoint maybe,
Yeah.
like something like not e-learning, which is like where the market is like heavily saturated, heavily moving right now is to like the self-paced e-learning, at least in the corporate side. If you're not
Mm,
showing off that skill set, it might be like the most beautiful projects, that probably honestly would help you land a role if people could see your potential. But,
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
gotta show off the in-demand skills and kinda show off the attention to detail and all of that as well.
Yeah, definitely.
So you don't need a ton, honestly. With one project, many people land really good remote corporate ID roles with a single flagship project that kinda checks all the boxes.
Yeah, and that one project that I had on there, I mean, it took about probably 1 to 2 months. I mean, I was also learning a lot of the tools, but
Yeah.
I mean, that alone shows you like how much time and effort it can go into that can be put into this just one project, and that really shows that you did spend time to understand the process and make sure it's quality.
Yeah, and I guess that gives you a good kinda jumping off point for some of these, like, behavioral interview questions, because you have at least one example of that, like, you can actually show people and, you spend
Yeah.
a lot of time working through. So,
Mm.
good
Yeah.
question there. Next question on the list is from Hazel, and it's, "Do you have any specific advice or anecdotes about initial phone screenings?" Hazel has, their first today, and they're not sure what to expect.
Okay. Oh, phone screening. So probably with like the hiring manager, or is it with the recruiter? Because I think sometimes that can be different. But like I know in general, I think for me in the beginning, I thought phone screen maybe wasn't something I should be too nervous about. At least like, but when I went into it, I realized that they do, even if it is the recruiter or the hiring manager, they sometimes really are asking like those challenging types of behavioral questions, or like what your experience is like and how it connects to instructional design. So like don't underestimate, I guess, the amount of detail that they might look for even in the phone screen. I think that'd be
Mm.
my biggest piece of advice.
Alright, and then, yeah, we have a few questions about the different types of interviews and how to navigate them. Any tips for behavioral interviews? I think that's where we dove into the STAR piece, but,
Mm.
anything that maybe we haven't mentioned about the behavioral interviews that you think would be helpful for people to know?
I think with the behavioral interviews, like that's where I would say do the most anticipation or like kind of trying to guess what those questions are going to be, because that's where you might get thrown off with like I got a
Mm.
lot of questions about ambiguity and just kind of like how do you handle unclear situations, or how do you know how to, like, how can you be a leader in this type of situation, or just kind of like those questions that you may not necessarily like be prepared for and might throw you off because it is really behavioral based and not necessarily connected to instructional design, or you may not see the clear connection to it right away. So I think just really trying to do your research there and think of as many examples as you possibly can.
Okay, good. Yeah, because yeah, that's scary. Like getting a question like that, and having to like come up with a response kind of on the fly. Oh
Yeah.
yeah, that sounds anxiety inducing. But I can see if you've like kind of reviewed your like 20 stories. It's like, well, this one goes into
Yeah.
leadership qualities, so let me pull this one out of the hat.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because I mean you might have a story that you put in this kind of like bucket, but then you realize, oh, actually I can like mix and match for what I need in that
Yeah,
moment. So
very
yeah.
cool. Cool. Yeah, you're like studying the story of yourself. That's what you're kind of quizzing yourself on.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it.
But good stuff. And I guess maybe we have time for one final question. But Tiffany is curious, and maybe a quick response. But Tiffany is curious about the practice assignments, or like the assignments you have to complete during the interview process. Do you have?
Mm,
Tiffany's asking for more details, but maybe do you have any quick recommendations about like what people may be looking for in an assignment like that?
yeah, I think that's just kind of, I mean, I think if you've done the preparation and have built projects prior to that, it's kind of similar basically. Like you're just kind of you have to be able to put it into action, I guess, and then show that you can do it under like a certain amount of time, like a certain deadline. So I
Yeah.
think that's where it's not necessarily what you're creating all the time. I think it's more like, can you do it quickly and can it still be quality? And I remember even they often would tell me, like, we're not super focused on the content. We're more so focused on, is it quality and can you do it quickly? So I think those are the top things.
Very cool. Good
Yeah.
stuff. Yeah, the attention to detail is what I always suggest to people. I mean, and the types of practice assignments can vary a ton, but um, we could probably do a whole session on those too.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
but I think we covered a lot of ground here. Let us all know what you think in the chat. Maybe let's get some applause emojis for Joanna. The little reaction. There we go. Yeah, the claps.
Love that. Thanks,
Very
everyone.
fun. Oh yeah, thanks Joanna for making the time. Maybe we share your LinkedIn URL in the chat. We'll share that so that people can connect with you and follow your journey on LinkedIn.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I saw someone mentioned about my website as well too, and I'd be happy to share that if you want to look. So,
cool.
yeah.
Yeah, the LinkedIn, the website, and then for those of you who are in the bootcamp, yeah, we're opening up office hours with you, so people can discuss this stuff with you one on one and get some help with their interviews and resumes and all of that. So good
Yes.
stuff. Thank you again, and we'll talk to you soon, Joanna. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you,
Bye bye,
everyone.
everybody.
Bye.